I'm Meredith Hoskin. I'm president of the City of Alameda Democratic Club, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to another installment of our 2025 speaker series. This series is all about, opening the door to a wide range of new voices and ideas from across the Democratic political spectrum. Our goal is really to hear new ideas, expand our thinking, and engage in more dialogue around some of those important topics and issues that are impacting us all. Before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to recognize any of our local leaders who may be joining us online. We're so grateful for the work our local and state representatives are doing every day to protect our communities, especially in the face of what we're seeing unfold at the federal level. Their leadership really reminds us why elections at every level are very important. We're also very inspired by the energy we're seeing in the people out on the streets. We had 3,000 people at Alameda City Hall last weekend, but it's important that we don't forget the 2026 midterms are just around the corner. This club is your local connection to the California Democratic Party. We meet the candidates, we make endorsements up and down the ballot, and we host events like this to keep our community informed and engaged. So if you're ready to help shape the future of the Democratic Party, Democratic leadership, we'd love to have you involved. So just reach out to us at alameda.demo, D-E-M-O, at gmail.com. Again, that's alameda.demo at gmail.com. And now I'm very excited to hand it over to our Vice President of Activities and Fundraising, Evan Schwartz Gomez, who will introduce tonight's special guest.
Brandon, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start off with just the basics. I would like you to tell us about where the Discourse and the Majority Report sort of fit into the online media space. And of course, the bigger question is, are you part of the manosphere?
I hope not. Well, before I answer your question, first let me say thank you, Evan, and thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the larger club for inviting me. I'm quite honored by the invitation, and I'm very grateful to be invited onto platforms like this, into spaces like this to have these conversations. I think having these conversations are such an underrated part of the democratic process. When I think about the Majority Report, words that come to mind are like new media, digital media, online media, independent media, right? When I think about shows like The Discourse or, analogs of The Discourse, like, Chapo Trap House, for example, or Piker's Stream, I think about, words like new left media, or maybe more derogatorily like the dirtbag left or things like that, right? But more important than any nomenclature, and maybe in the risking like reinventing the wheel, I think it's more important to understand the distinctions between shows like the Majority Report and perhaps older forms of media, more entrenched forms of legacy media, as well as shows like The Discourse, and the differences between the Majority Report and then also more legacy and more entrenched forms of media, right? And when I think of the Majority Report, the things that distinguish it from perhaps older and more entrenched forms of media, obviously the first thing that comes to mind are the platforms that it utilizes to spread its message, to spread its content, right? So that is encapsulated by, I think, the term new media, where you have in the early 2000s, the late 90s, this shift in digital technology from Web 1 to Web 2, right? So it becomes a lot easier for people who are not as technically sophisticated to build their own websites, host their own content on websites. And part of that move, that revolution, included political content. And so I think the technological advancements in the early 2000s gave way to an early democratization of the media space, that was taken advantage of by some like early trendsetters like the Majority Report, like the Young Turks, like Democracy Now, like even more, I think, people that we would consider to be entrenched into the status quo legacy media machine, like Ezra Klein and Maddie Iglesias. They started off on more independent like wonk blog type like sites that were popular at the time. Other things that I think distinguish the Majority Report from like more traditional forms of media is that independent label. So, the proportion of revenue or profit or money that the Majority Report brings in that's crowdfunding versus sponsors, I don't know, but it's certainly a different form of funding than we might see at an MSNBC. Same with places like, the Democracy Now!, which is entirely funded by viewers. Same as TYT, which I know has different funding mechanisms, but has a crowdfunding component, which is separate from something like MSNBC or CNN, Fox News, which is largely funded by corporations, corporate sponsors, large corporate sponsors, I should say, and then like billionaires usually. Um, Additionally, I think, you have to talk about the time when the Majority Report and shows like that rise up, which is in the, mid-aughts, where there was, I think, a dearth of media in liberal spaces that, captured the moment in a way that was being missed, I think, by more entrenched sources. And that moment being like general dissatisfaction with the George Bush administration, with the Iraq War, the war on terror, and the obvious failures that came along with that, both at home and abroad. And a lot of mainstream liberal sources, by nature of the fact that Democrats had joined in with Republicans to promote that war at the time, ultimately were not as critical as they could have been. And I think a lot of people felt that and gravitated towards, more like, alternative media sources. When I think about, shows like The Discourse, right, and New Left media, I think there are obviously some parallels between what distinguishes it from, legacy media and how it fits into that sort of genealogy of new technology being developed. So obviously things like TikTok, different crowdfunding sources, more developed crowdfunding sources like Patreon, Twitch streaming obviously comes about and allows for more seamless live streaming technology. So things like that, like technological advancements, continue to contribute to like burgeoning advancements in, I think, leftist media. But in terms of content, and this is true, I think, about shows like The Majority Report, and it's something that I think right-wing media captured a lot earlier than left-wing media, which is that shows like The Majority Report, shows like The Young Turks, even shows like Democracy Now!, and then obviously shows that are sort of second, third generations of those kind of left media, I think they understand that a lot of people watch the news as entertainment and more readily embrace that fact in a way that wasn't always embraced by more liberal aligned legacy media outlets, which is not to say that there's a total lack of humor or levity there. I think, just shows that arise in the independent media space more embrace the idea that a lot of people are involved in this space because they find political news and cultural news to be actually quite interesting and fascinating, not just the rote recitation of news or that kind of thing. And finally, I think the thing that distinguishes new left media from stuff like The Majority Report, and then even more distinguishes it from legacy media sources, and the first thing that comes to mind, I think people would say the humor, right? There's like a crassness to shows like mine, I fully admit to, and casualness to shows like mine, right? They'll call something like a hangout podcast, right? And that's definitely something that's worth interrogating, especially how it fits into a new gap in people's lives that is social alienation, people missing out on those kinds of social interactions, those kinds of intimate social interactions, and how, more casual shows or shows with a more casual presentation fit that space in their lives. But also, I think, and this is present within shows like The Majority Report and The Young Turks, but I think is even more amplified in shows like mine or Chapo Trap House, is there's like a true anger that I think new left media shows capture that I think a lot of people feel like have been missing from more legacy media sources. And certainly, I think now in the era of Trump's second term, while he's leading this international and domestic terror campaign against marginalized populations, really every population, a lot of people are feeling that lack of anger even more. And so when I think about the defining characteristic of like new left media, why it's so popular, what space it's filling in a lot of people's lives, I think it's this anger that has been missing from a lot of traditional media sources, from a lot of like Democrat sources. And, while it's maybe a little controversial of an answer, more controversial than humor, right? I think that, it's important and it's true. And it's not something that I shy away from because ultimately I think it's good. I think people should be angry. I think when we have a president who comes out and wants to take away resources, wants to take away the systems that support the most deprived in our society, that he wants to take away the safety net from people who rely on it the most, our elderly, our disabled, our sick, our young. I think you're right to be angry when, the Trump administration, when the Republicans went to strip away a woman's right to choose. I think you're right to be pissed off. And I think people deserve to have that anger validated, especially since the right has no problem validating the anger of their base over completely made up grievances. So
Yeah,
I know
that's
I went on there a little long, but I thought it was a good question.
great. Yeah, I think I heard a lot of stuff in there. So if I'm understanding correctly, the majority report, which is more like in some ways traditional news shows, in that there's like a person at a desk, right, who's presenting a story, and then there's a conversation about it. While the streaming world, like the Discourse, and then you mentioned Hassan as well, in Chapo Trap House, that's more like a social gathering that happens online. Is that right?
Yes, I think that shows like the Majority Report and the Young Turks are oftentimes at the time when they arose acting as like supplemental media sources for maybe a younger, more technologically savvy liberal class who is interested in getting, maybe a more complete version of the news that they feel is being, lacking from traditional news sources. And the presentation of those shows is oftentimes mirroring those traditional news sources. You have uh, pundits behind a desk, you have a chyron, you have some of the traditional trappings of a traditional news source. And it just even a lot of overlap. I know Sam hosts shows on MSNBC. Jink used to have a show on MSNBC. So there was a time where there was a lot more overlap between new media and traditional media when it came to things like that. There's not as much of that now. But yeah, so I think that's one distinction. And I think what we're seeing now, as society has in some ways deteriorated, there is a more accelerated, more acute form of social alienation that makes people not necessarily long for the same trappings of old media when it comes to getting information, but long for the more, I think, platonic intimate feeling of like sharing ideas with friends, having the type of friends that like you seem to relate to when it comes to those sorts of things, and feeling less isolated in that kind of content. I think that, new left media, streaming content in general, like this sort of casual form of content, fills that gap that society has, engendered in people for like social interaction.
Yeah, and that's part of why this kind of conversation, I'm hoping we can center some of it around the levity aspect, because you're right that a lot of this new media comes from a place of being angry, right? And there's like nowhere to express that, or we're told that we need to button up and behave a certain way if we want to fit into just general society. So let's just touch on goofiness really quick. You said lots of things, and we will start coming back to some of that other stuff, but all of the online news shows that I watch, they use soundboards. So they play sound bites of politicians saying stupid things. And the Majority Report has an arsenal of literally Hanna-Barbera cartoon sound effects, like the boo, banana peel sounds, and all the boing, all that. And they play those while reacting to clips. So you might have a clip of like Tim Pool saying something dumb, and then you hear something from like, a Flintstone sound effect. But that really raises a question of if people who are presenting this material are angry, and that's why it's being discussed, how do we know when something is okay to make fun of versus being too serious? An example of that is that there's been online arguments lately on if it's okay to make fun of Trump's appearance if we would never use physical slurs against someone that we actually like. So where is the line?
Well, I think there are a lot of things in that question I'd like to hone in on. So that last thing is what I'll start with. Where is the line? I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that like the line is going to be different for each individual person. It is going to be something that is informed for each individual person by their experiences, by their positionality, the people in their lives who it reminds them of. And that for that reason, the line is always going to be almost impossible to not cross for every single person, right? And that's not a way to absolve yourself of, never caring about upsetting somebody or just allowing yourself to say whatever you want. It's just a way to acknowledge that by nature of how diverse a lot of us are, in identity and experience, it's just always going to be hard to never say anything that upsets anybody. And I think the most important thing to do is, in lieu of that and acknowledgement of that, is just create spaces where people feel as though they're able to communicate the fact that you maybe overstepped the line for them, and we can maybe work from there, right? We can interrogate what that means, why, is it reasonable? I like to consider my audience adults, so I expect them to, show a little bit of discernment when it comes to like saying something oversteps the line. I do my best to not say things that knowingly will upset large groups of people simply for the sake of upsetting them, especially if that is something that, and I think this is an important, way, or yeah, an important way to not, chronically overstep really, really important lines, is to make sure that the things that you're saying are, not punching down, right? The classic comedy rule: don't punch down, try to do your best to aim your jabs at, the powerful people who are controlling the lever of power, and not at people who are often like downtrodden. That's what makes right-wing comedy so not funny. It's always aimed at punching down, which comes across as like lowbrow, mean-spirited, etc. So, but even acknowledging that, there is no way to never say anything that upsets other people, right? So being open to criticism, being open to, listening to people in your community and how they feel, and then also being open to explain, yourself and your logic, if you can, for why you think that something might be okay to say. I think ultimately it might just be a circumstance where I'm wrong or they're wrong, but being able to talk about that might be a good, learning experience for everybody. So, I don't necessarily shy away from those moments where I overstep the line, or even where I feel like I don't overstep the line, but someone feels like I overstepped the line and I disagree, because it's in those moments, it's in those conflicts that I think there are opportunities to build trust and to build rapport, where we may not disagree, we may not agree on something, but we're understanding where each other's coming from, and we're able to have this open dialogue. And more than anything, people feel like they're able to come and share that you might have upset them without feeling like you're going to jump down their throat. I think that, that's the fear that a lot of people have, that when they tell you that you upset them, that you stepped over a line, that instead of like critically thinking about that and, apologizing if you feel like that's, not your intention, or you hadn't considered what you were saying. But instead of doing that, getting defensive and jumping down people's throat in some sort of ego defense. I try not to do that. I try not to cultivate an audience that feels like if somebody expresses a criticism of me, that they need to jump down their throat and defend me, because, we can talk about these things. We can have these difficult conversations, and I think we can have them in ways that leave us all feeling, if not good, but more informed.
That's a really great lead into this next point, because we're talking a little bit about we're interacting with people who we disagree with and who disagree with us. And in some ways it's to try to help them learn and improve, and help us learn and improve. But there's also like a question of just like forming alliances with people who are imperfect. This was definitely something that was touched on in our last guest series. So one thing that you do really well on the Discourse is tease out how contradictions in political culture often go unexamined, and especially when it comes to these ideas of alliances. So we've seen moments lately where figures like Candace Owens and AOC are vocally aligned on an issue, or Tucker Carlson and Jon Stewart, even Anna Kasparian and Piers Morgan. And they find themselves sharing similar critiques. When those moments happen, how should we make sense of them? And more importantly, maybe, when those roads involve discredited or actual harmful figures, how do we decide which alliances are worth pursuing and which ones risk legitimizing people we really shouldn't amplify?
I don't know if I have the correct answer to that question, right? I think there are a lot of different opinions on what it means to form an alliance with, a right-wing content maker or influencer. I don't know what like alliance means in that sense. I think there are lessons to be taken, right? When a right-wing influencer starts to, for example, criticize Israel, when a right-wing influencer starts to, mobilize the language of redistributive economics, when a right-wing influencer starts to engage in that kind of like faux populism, there's a lesson to be learned from that, which is that the ideas of the left are so popular, or at the very least, the ideas of the status quo are so unpopular that there is now an audience for language that sounds like it is progressive, that there's language that sounds like it is from the left. And I think that right wingers, especially right wing, content creators, are not ignorant of that fact. They oftentimes know what they're doing. They know that they are purposefully and strategically mobilizing this language in order to trick people into adopting a reactionary worldview because, this language is popular. That's why when the Democratic Party has their primary, a lot of people adopt language around Medicare for all, run away from it. That's why Trump, he oftentimes adopts a right-wing populist framework. That's why we're seeing right-wing populists rise around around Western Europe and around Europe in general, and around the world in general, actually, because a lot of these ideas of distributive economics are quite popular, and they are, from the right being packaged along with a reactionary worldview as it comes to gender politics, when it comes to immigration politics, when it comes to racial politics. And the unfortunate reality, and I think what makes a lot of the alliances seem more desirable than they actually are, is that right-wingers, right-wing content creators oftentimes don't have as difficult of a time getting platformed in mainstream spaces. Like right-wingers who are trying to launder faux populism, into mainstream discourse as as a legitimate political ideology that people should actually latch on to and like think is anything but a scam. They have no trouble getting on some of the largest platforms. They have no trouble getting onto mainstream media. When left wingers, when people who are trying to argue for economic redistribution of wealth from the top to the bottom, from a leftist perspective, try to get on those same shows, it's just a lot harder. So I think, a lot of leftist people who work in leftist media understand this dynamic and see alliances with the far right as an opportunity to reach an untapped market that otherwise might not be, might not hear these messages at all. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm very sympathetic to the reality that leftist analysis of what's wrong with society, what causes a lot of the problems that people are currently suffering from, that lead to this social alienation, that lead to these feelings of hopelessness, et cetera, that has been just stripped out of our formal education system. It's been stripped out of a lot of our media. And so it feels like any moves you make to correct that just erasure of information is right. But I mean, I'm also aware that we have to be critical of the fact that a lot of these people are coming to these points, like I said, strategically to trick people, knowingly to trick people into believing reactionary politics, not to trick people into some kind of, bipartisan anti-war agenda, but to trick people into supporting some, more nefarious form of imperialism or neocolonialism usually. So I think, from my perspective, there really isn't much use in anti-Israel alliance that is, one half explicitly neo-Nazi and the other half, anti-imperialist. That is not of value to the left. That might be of short-term value to prevent some kind of, furthering escalation of current genocide. But what is the long-term implication of normalizing that idea? Another genocide. So I look at a lot of these desires for an alliance as born out of maybe good intentions, but failing to realize that you're not necessarily normalizing these ideas, but you're legitimizing the inclusion of these ideas into spaces, which is oftentimes what these far right people want. Like the primary goal of the far right is to launder neo-Nazi talking points into public discourse as just another idea that you can have that is a legitimate, political position. Because fascism, Nazism, despite what it may seem like when you spend a lot of time on Twitter, is not a very popular ideology. When people are identified as Nazis, they oftentimes are very unpopular. What has happened, though, is that there's been a muddying of the waters around what is Nazism, what is racism, what is bigotry, what is misogyny, to make it harder to identify. And that has only benefited the far right. And so when you make these alliances with people on the far right, you are working towards their ultimate aim, which is to, normalize these positions, normalize their positions, in society as being legitimate. So, maybe there's a little bit of short-term exposure that you can use to help equip a few more people in their audience with the tools of leftist analysis to better insulate them from some of the, reactionary logic that they're going to be, hit with every day on, so example, Candace Owens' show. But you're also, working towards their long-term goal of having people in your audience just like, if not explicitly becoming a neo-Nazi, thinking like, well, that's just an okay thing to be. Like some people just, think that people who are of different races are literally biologically inferior to people of other races. That's just an okay thing that you can think. Like that's, it may seem like a small goal, but it is one of their primary goals when you think about like their long-term plan of, retaking society and making it more fascistic and in their like image.
Yeah, that was a lot of really good information, and you really also made me think about how even the question that I asked you was kind of centered around the content creators, right? I listed off a bunch of famous people who have opinions publicly, but it's almost like the ones we really need to be hopeful for are their audience members who are being fooled in some way. And I know how hard that is to even just try to have some type of empathy for somebody who follows alt-right media, even if they're, obviously, if they're a neo-Nazi, but like somebody who is kind of an economic populist that only hears economic populism from Donald Trump in 2016. It's hard to empathize with that person for their economic woes because I can't look past the racist bigotry stuff, And there has to be at some point some type of reckoning between what we want on the left, especially economically, and what the people on the right have been searching for and fed lies. And you brought up a really good point about these different spaces. Some of our audience from before, they've already seen this, but I want you to take a look at it too. It's a clip from PBS NewsHour. And essentially, this is a person from Media Matters. They are a left-wing progressive think tank, and they did a study about where partisanship takes place in media. So we'll go ahead and just play this now.
We just did this really big study that looked on online voices and sort of the largest programs, sort of political and and sort of political adjacent, left adjacent, right adjacent. But when you add it all up, the right and right-leaning and right-adjacent programming accounts for 82% of the major online shows. That's podcasts, that's streaming channels. That's narrative dominance.
And that includes podcasts that aren't overtly political, like sports and comedy podcasts, for instance.
Yeah, that was the part that was the most, to me, surprising and yet disturbing about the study is that, of the 400 plus shows that we looked at, 100 or so of them were non-political, sports, culture. But when you actually looked at an analysis of the program, you listened to them, you coded them, we found that 72% of them, 72% of explicitly non-political programming contained not only political content, but right-leaning political content. They just branded it or framed it as something different. And that's where this really becomes key, is that is the lens through which people see the world. And so when all of that programming is sort of tilting the scales in favor of the right, the story that the majority of Americans are getting day to day is right-leaning. And I see no better illustration of that gap than if you look at, in particular, what's happening with young people. Young people are accelerating and moving to the right faster than any other demographic. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they just happen to consume online media more than any other demographic does. That's their primary source, and yet they themselves are moving at a faster and faster clip to the right because that landscape is so heavily dominated and saturated by the right.
So, and I'm not sure if you saw on your screen, but the Majority Report made it onto the infographic, which is pretty cool. But the question is, should people on the left go into these right-leaning spaces to be a left-wing voice now that we do have data that backs up the fact that silencing ourselves has pretty much been a net negative? And I do know that there's the concept of not platforming certain figures, but in the case of there being basically they're platforming us at that point, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, ultimately, I think that we have to accept, or at least I have to accept, and perhaps people who are in my position as like leftists who are trying to evangelize leftism have to accept that we're working from a disadvantage, right? We're working from a position where the vast majority of Americans have been sold a bill of sale about what is effective management of society, what is an effective administering or administration of the state that is heavily skewed towards reactionary politics, right? So when I see that chart of the right-leaning podcasts or right-leaning media sources versus left-leaning media sources, I understand that that is happening organically as a result of the fact that the vast majority of our culture is right-leaning in one way or another. There is much made about the liberal media and some like token elements of, wokeism that exist in Hollywood or exist in academia, but, buried not too far under the surface of a lot of those institutions are heavily reactionary politics, pro-corporate politics, pro-military politics, pro-imperialist politics, pro-racist politics, things that maybe on the surface appear to be, vaguely aligned with some kind of social justice movement, oftentimes, are working towards furthering the aims of systemic oppression, right? By trying to supplant people's understanding of systemic oppression with the specific individual moral and intellectual failures of like, races of specific, usually people coded as being from the South, coded as being low intelligent. And, that's what we're supposed to think of when we think of racism, not for example, not the structures that exist to uphold racism. So, when I think about like the prevalence of far right media, I think that's a reflection of a culture that is just generally pretty far right, despite what people want to think. And the lessons that are being taught oftentimes by our political figures underpinning and validating far right ideas, even if the, surface level of rhetoric is seemingly antagonistic to it, seemingly pro social justice. So when it comes to going into right-wing spaces, I think, leftists sometimes have to be, have to acknowledge that our ideas just are not viewed as valid by the vast majority of Americans because they've been taught to view them as being somehow, foreign. A lot of people associate like any sort of redistributive policies with like socialism or communism, which has been coded as like being anti-American since the Cold War. A lot of people associate any kind of like policy that is too far left as being fantastical. If they're in the Democratic Party, like anything further left than, your milquetoast neoliberal policy is like, it's impossible. It's a fantasy. Forget the fact that it happened in this country 60 years ago or 50 years ago. Forget the fact that it's happening in countries all over the world right now. It's a fantasy. So part of, I think, being an evangelist on the left right now is doing the same work that fascists had to do post, World War II, and they're still doing, which is trying to launder leftist ideas into the public discourse in a way that makes sense to people and is meeting them where they're currently at when it comes to the framework by which they understand society and how it functions. And so I think that leftists have to, be willing to go on some of these platforms, not make long-term alliance. I'm not saying that we have to have like a crosstalk style show, like me and Tucker Carlson have to, rap every week about this sort of thing. But being willing to have these difficult conversations is just going to be part of the process by which we, get people more used to thinking of leftist policies and leftist politics as being like legitimate solutions to problems that they have in society. A lot of people will, point to crime as though there's no leftist theory about how we do crime prevention, as though the only leftist opinion on crime is that we let it happen. And then like, streets are just like littered with dead bodies or some like ridiculous fantasy that people project onto the left. It's like, no, leftists have a progressive theory of crime prevention. It just emphasizes like a bucket of structural solutions, not punitive measures, because we understand that like, yes, you might be able to take one poor person off the streets. But if you create the circumstances in society that creates homeless people, there's just always going to be another person to replace that homeless person. There's always just going to be another person to fill that role. So, there are real leftist solutions to the problems that conservatives brand their entire party around, like, the immigrant crisis or the crime or like the epidemic of crime or a number of things. It's just people have not been taught to think of leftist solutions when they think of those particular issues. They think of conservative solutions. They think of, punitive measures. They think of private-public partnerships. Despite the fact that a lot of those things have failed over and over again, they are still taught to legitimize them and to delegitimize leftist ideas, just offhand.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And before I respond, I want to remind everybody who's watching to submit questions to the Q&A, because we will be switching over to audience questions in the next several minutes. So definitely keep getting those in there. So a couple things come to mind. One of them is that we are sort of ceding that space to allow that messaging to happen, right? We're saying like, well, the right wing is, and I'm agreeing with you that the right wing is manipulating what we want to do on the left and turning it into something negative. It's been a centuries-long thing maybe to happen. But then also when we're not like forcing ourselves to go into the spaces where they're talking about us, like we're creating that power vacuum where they do get to set the narrative. And not just that, but when we think about these shows, like I'm looking at this infographic. The shows that they mentioned that are more like sports related, for example, that happen to have some right-wing commentary on them. Part of me does wonder if that's because it's so much harder to have conversations on the left without risking offending somebody, and it's because we don't want to do that. It's what you and I talked about at the beginning of this conversation, right? There's going to be times when we all can learn from something that we said, but it's also, there's like a fear we have to get over to say that. I don't think people on the right really struggle with that same issue, and that's probably an empathy thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. But what it may lead to is that they will talk about their own political feelings and their own political leanings way more casually and way more matter-of-factly than kind of trying to tiptoe around and be perfect about it all. So to recap, what I'm saying is like we maybe should be in those spaces to have a voice and not let them take over the power of that. And then also maybe we need to be more forgiving of ourselves and each other if we say the wrong thing in those spaces or anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the conversation around people being castigated about saying the wrong thing can be a little overblown. And I certainly don't think that right-wingers don't get offended when they are talking in their own spaces. I don't watch a lot of sports shows, but they seem pretty animated when someone says something wrong about LeBron James or about Stephen Curry's jump shot form. They get offended all the time. I think a lot of the stuff that's projected onto the left sometimes are just part of the propaganda war against the left to try to make the left seem exceptionally disorganized or exceptionally prone to infighting or exceptionally backbiting. I don't think that's the case. I watch a lot of far-right media. I've seen the lawsuits against Steven Crowder. I've seen the breakups at the Daily Wire. I've seen all of the fights between various more entrenched right-wing commentators like Tim Pool versus the more far-right, out of the mainstream, or at least not as mainstream adjacent right-wing commentators like Nick Fuentes and stuff like that. I think that a lot of that stuff is just used to demonize the left in a way that is just not necessarily accurate. I think there's a lot more solidarity on the left than there is in any other space online. I think when it comes to people getting mad about things that you say, people are going to get mad. People are going to get upset. People are going to not like things that you say. People are going to disagree with you. People are going to criticize you. People are going to be unfair to you. People are going to take things you say out of context. I think none of that stuff is nice. None of that stuff is fair, but it's not unique to the left. And I do think sometimes people try to, and this is part of the larger conversation around cancel culture. Sometimes people have a very, real anxiety surrounding their social position as a public intellectual, someone who relies on their, at least in portion for their the viability of their profession, that people like them. People have a positive opinion of them, that they have a positive public profile. And when that's a big portion of how you make your living, there is an anxiety that maybe one day people won't have that positive opinion about you. Maybe one day your fans will turn against you. Maybe one day you'll be deplatformed. And I think there's been a lot of work done. And this is not just been by people on the right, it's been by people across the media spectrum to make that very specific class anxiety, that very specific anxiety that belongs to specific small part of our population into like a larger issue that seemingly is supposed to have like a larger impact on society. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that again, if you keep an open mind, if you're open to communicating, if you're open to like understanding, you know, giving real legitimate apologies, there's nothing that really should like, you know, I think people are in some ways like, right, you know, if people overreact to, and I try to be thoughtful about stuff like this. If people can be said to overreact to things that you say wrong on shows, I think it's a result of a broad lack of accountability that people are hypersensitive to that is, you know, incredibly common in our culture. There's a lack of accountability in our political system. There's a lack of accountability in our political media. There's no amount that you can get things wrong that you seem to lose your job or have people think less of you if you're a pundit at a well-entrenched legacy media outlet. There's no amount of crime you can seemingly do if you're a well-connected politician that gets you even out of your seat. And so I think when you are a more casual media figure, people can sometimes maybe like overcompensate or being hyper reactive when it comes to that and, you know, try to capture whatever accountability that they can. But, you know, I think that part of being a good leftist, part of being somebody who is aware and critical of these systems is to understand that and to, you know, maybe, you know, when some people overreact, maybe de-escalate, try to like take that overreaction for what it is, like, and de-escalate the situation.
Okay, so that there's two things that I would like to get into about that. I think first I want to talk about how, since for background for our viewers right now, the Discourse will take chats. So you go and you read the chats out loud, and then the Majority Report, you guys actually take phone calls. And so one of the main reasons, and I told you this before, that I wanted to invite you specifically to speak to us is because I've seen you be a really great listener in those spaces. And it's like amongst the sea of hosts that just love to hear themselves talk, not putting shade on any of, on the Majority Report, it's all across the internet and on TV. But, you know, like I said, you take time to read comments and you like really listen during these call-in segments. You give people room to be heard, but even when they're coming in hot or from these unexpected angles. So in an online culture where everyone's trying to prove that they're the smartest in the room, what does it mean to listen well? And how do you resist the pressure to always have the last word?
Well, first, I'm honored and slightly shocked that you would consider me to be one of the people who likes to hear their voice the least on the left, considering how much I like to go on and on. But I mean, great. I'm glad I get off that impression.
Well, I can tell you why that is. So when you guys have the call-ins, you know, I watch you wait until the person fully finishes speaking on the phone. And then if they start to say something again, you'll like go back to listening, and I see your face actually paying attention. And your other hosts do that too, but I don't see that everywhere. I really don't see active listening. So that's kind of where that came from. And sorry to interrupt. Please tell us more.
No. I mean, I think some of that comes from my background as a social scientist. I genuinely find people very interesting. And so I oftentimes try to take what they're saying and, you know, consider it very critically, right? You know, not to just repeat what you said, but back at you as an answer. But the reason I do that is because I like to acknowledge that, like, while I have my own perspective, while I have my own expertise, other people have their own. I think one of the trappings or one of the traps you can fall into when you are a commentator, when you're a pundit, especially one that is, you know, and this is no shade to anyone, because I don't think you necessarily have to have like an advanced degree in social science to even engage in social theorizing or do social science. But that's my point. I think one of the traps that people who maybe are journalists or fall into punditry fall into is the belief that the people who operate outside those spaces are passive in their engagements with society, that they're static consumers of information that just like pluck things out of the news and put it in their heads, unchanged, unaltered, or whatever. But as you know, as somebody who was trained in social science, I understand that everyone, as they try to navigate the world, everyone as they navigate the world develops their own understanding of the world. They develop their own pet theories about the way the world works. They develop their own like folk science around the way people's bodies work. And for example, when we talk about bodybuilding, people are very good and very observant and always on the lookout for patterns that they can use to make sense of the world. And so when people call in or when people write in their comments, I understand that they're working, I work from that point of view, that they're trying to tell me about their theory about the world works. And while I might have a different theory, maybe when we combine those theories or when those theories brush up against each other in conflict, we will have a stronger theory as a result of that. And then just from a more basic standpoint, a lot of my viewers are very smart. A lot of my viewers are accomplished. They have their own careers. They have their own expertises. I have my own expertise. And just as a curious person, when someone, comments like, hey, I'm actually an animator. And that thing that you said reminded me of this thing that goes on specifically in the field of animation. I find that stuff like generally very interesting. And, it just helps weave a tapestry of, it helps weave a more complex tapestry of our understanding of the world. Because one thing I think that can happen, especially when you're engaging in news commentary or even like social science, is that you can abstract problems by relying too much on numbers, by relying too much on data. And while I think those like larger data points, does like that larger quantitative data is very important, because we want to be able to understand how people's individual narratives are situated within like the larger patterns that we see within society, so that we can understand like, well, is this an exceptional case or just an example of like what's happening all over the place? I do think it's really important to have those comments, to have those stories, to have people call in and explain their experiences and theories about why things are happening, to add color to that data. And for people to understand that, when you say that 770,000 Americans are homeless, that's a person's like life. That's not just a number. That's someone's whole life.
Yeah. And it sort of touches on what you had mentioned in the beginning about how there's a social component to new media and streaming culture, especially. I don't have a clip of the Discourse to play right now, but I've watched it many, many times. And one thing is that you always see the chats coming through of people not just talking to you and being like, Brandon, blah, 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 blah. They talk to each other. And there really is like a sense of community that happens for 4 hours every day whenever you start streaming. And people talk about the topics you bring, but you also bring topics that they want to talk about. So I generally view a lot of interactions online, especially with content creators, as being parasocial as opposed to social. But do you feel like there is an actual true connection and community that benefits from each other when these streams are active?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that sociality. And I think it's a really important part to cultivating people's attachment. People, call it parasocial. And then I think there's some truth to that. People do develop a strong attachment to streamers and they develop a strong attachment to those spaces. But that's no different than the larger phenomenon that we're seeing developing all over the political spectrum, all over society, of people, falling into all sorts of different fringe groups, whether they be conspiracy-oriented groups, QAnon, flat earthers, political fringe groups like MAGA. There is a longing for social inclusion that is driving people towards, different group belonging that perhaps they would otherwise not be attracted to if they were more well integrated into their, like community, their like own like physical community, people around them. But obviously, by nature of the fact that a lot of people work very long hours, they're very isolated by nature of that, they oftentimes are unable to develop those like personal relationships until they gravitate to ones online. And so I think it's very valuable to have those spaces. And more than anything, I like to look at my community as collaborative. Like we're working together to solve problems, working together to build new knowledge, working together to build a more complex understanding of the world around us. I say all the time, like, I don't have all the answers, but I'm hoping that we can find them together, through engaging in this sort of discourse, engaging in rigorous meeting of the minds.
Great. Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue to bring in a Q&A question, which is from Wyeth, who is a board member at the Alameda Democratic Club. And as a reminder to everybody, the Q&A button is at the bottom. I'm sure you know where it is. But She asks, what policy issue do you think most reveals the gap between elite narratives and the material needs of working class Black Americans?
Oh man, elite narratives in working class Black Americans, right? So I would say I think a lot of the most pressing concerns of working class Black Americans are the most pressing concerns of most Americans, right? I think a lot of the things that most Americans are suffering from, a lack of affordable housing, a lack of accessible job opportunities, a lack of affordable healthcare are things that are magnified when you're talking about marginalized communities, but are impacting everybody, right? But if I had to pick simply one of those issues that I think is, most impacting the Black community, I would have to say, I think it would have to be the inequality in healthcare. I think that there is an element to our healthcare system, the racialized health gap that is incredibly pervasive, that causes like a large amount of what I would consider to be, excess death within the Black community, medicalized racism, and obviously parallel to that too. And I would consider this to be, perhaps the only other bigger issue that is like the inequality when it comes to law enforcement and how it oftentimes acts as an exacerbating effect in Black communities when it comes to extracting wealth and extracting people out of the community in ways that prevent reintegration in productive ways. So it becomes like a self-fulfilling cycle there. So I know I said one thing, but those two things, like health inequality and inequality in law enforcement, the two-tier justice system, would be the two major things that I would identify as impacting the Black community. In terms of policy positions that would redress those grievances, again, I think the only policy positions that you could possibly do to redress those grievances would have to be broad in application. And it would have to be, I think, not a specific one thing that you can do, but a broad bucket of social changes that are meant to tackle like different issues from different vectors, right? So when I say like health inequality, that can't just be building new hospitals in the community, right? It has to also be a more comprehensive health education system within the inner city. It has to be, attention paid towards like food insecurity in a food desert. So like any one problem is going to have like a bucket of solutions.
Yeah.
That's a cop-out answer, I realize.
No, not at all. Alameda has tried really hard to address a lot of these issues. We're a really small city, but we're in the middle of the Bay Area, California, and we have a lot of like really progressive policies, like much broader rent control, for example. We're one of the few cities, and I think we might have been the first to implement fees or like no fees allowed from DoorDash and Uber Eats, where they were manipulating menu prices and affecting small businesses. And I think that having these multifaceted attacks against these systemic problems it's like the only way that you can actually have a successful and thriving community. So I think everyone on this call would agree with you. We have another question coming in. This is from Meredith. So she asks, who is an emerging progressive Democratic leader you feel we should keep an eye on outside of the obvious?
What's the obvious?
I'm not sure.
Well, assuming the obvious is AOC, I would say I'm very excited about the recent victory of Zohran Mamdani in the Democratic primary for mayor of New York City, right? And the reason I'm excited about that is because I think, going back to what I said in answer to a few of the questions, there's been so much work done to delegitimize leftist policy solutions to societal problems in one way or another, right? They're socialist, so they're un-American. They're fantastical, so they're impossible. And having a mayor of New York City who is explicitly socialist in his political agenda, self-avowed, right? Who's aiming to engage in some of these broad, sweeping social justice policies that we haven't seen embraced by the Democrat Party establishment in a while, provides us with the opportunity to ask leftists, ask Democrats who are in favor of, more comprehensive change coming from our politicians, to point to New York City as a laboratory for that kind of success. At the case study, when people say these sorts of things like providing free busing, like, providing rent freeze to tenants are impossible, we'll have a place that we can point to that is happening in the country that can be used to go like, well, it is possible, which won't convince everyone. Obviously, it will be people who deny reality, as we've seen become a lot more pervasive in our political system. But it will be a step in the right direction to help people understand that a lot of what they've been sold as the solution to the problems like crime, like health inequality, like joblessness, like homelessness, by conservatives and even by like more reactionary Democrats, is just not the solution to those problems.
Yeah. So now to close it out, I want to take us back just very quickly to media, new media, and how legacy media has been trying to work its way into the internet. We've seen more legacy news folks starting YouTube and social media channels. Like Don Lemon is an example of someone who left the newsroom, then went to social media, got dumped by Musk, and he's now on YouTube. Do you feel like these figures are welcome in online spaces? So I guess what I'm asking you is, if life gives you Don Lemon, do you give Don lemonade?
Well, I would love if I had the power to deny people access to posting content on YouTube, and not just for explicitly political reasons. I also don't like those ASMR videos, so I might get rid of those for particularly petty and personal reasons. No offense to anyone who enjoys ASMR videos. But I do think that the move by people like Don Lemon, and I would even maybe more highlight people like Tucker Carlson, who I know since his interview with not JD Vance, with Ted Cruz went semi-viral, he's had a bit of a resurgence. But I think when more legacy media pundits move to online spaces like Twitter or X or whatever, they are going to have to adapt in ways that, they might not necessarily be prepared for, because a lot of the, popularity that they enjoyed on legacy news outlets, and I guess this is again more exemplified by Tucker Carlson, was due to having like a hostage audience, a captive audience who turns on Fox News every day and leaves it on, and therefore whatever happens to be on is what they watch. When they go online, obviously they're able to translate some of that audience into online viewership. But a lot of that audience is not going to make that transition, again, more readily apparent with Tucker Carlson, because the audience of Fox News is a little bit older. So switching from like a cable news show to an online news show is going to be a little bit more of a burden for them. And I think that even with Don Lemon's content, I've watched a little bit. I watched that interview with Elon Musk. I've seen his content take on, I think, a little bit more of an edge since it's been online. There's been a little bit more of an antagonism towards the far right in his content that I think sells better online, sells better in more new media spaces. And I think that's the transition that is happening for a lot of those figures. A lot of legacy news outlet figures like Tucker Carlson, like Don Lemon, maybe they start their online career with producing the same kind of content that they were making for CNN or for Fox News, but they rapidly start to see that that content doesn't do as well when the audience isn't like being forced to tune in due to like habit, and then they're forced to move over to a more radicalized position. And I think again, I can't stop anyone from being online, nor would I really want to. That's not true. I probably would want to stop at least some people from being online, even myself sometimes. But like, I think, again, it's more about taking that as the sign of the times and not necessarily trying to read it as like, oh, good, now we have another advocate in Don Lemon. I look at people like Don Lemon becoming more radical in their message, whether it's authentic or just following the audience that they happen to have now online. I look at Tucker Carlson becoming more radical in his message, in some ways more radically anti-Semitic, but more radical in his message as a sign that the establishment politics as they exist are just no longer popular. They're no longer as viable as they used to be. I think that's evidenced by a lot of the traditional legacy media channels not doing as well, their ratings not doing as well, and even some of the more legacy media adjacent channels that make content that is very similar to the legacy media on the far right is like falling apart, like the Daily Wire. And I think that does bode, at least, makes me optimistic for the future, because it means that like when you're stripped of the trappings of the name brand of an MSNBC, when you're stripped of the trappings of the name brand of something like a New York Times or Fox News, you're forced to adopt a more authentic message. And seeing that happen, what I'm able to read from that scenario is that, what people authentically want is a anti-establishment message. If that message comes from the right, they'll accept that. If it comes from the left, they'll accept that. But they're tired of establishment politics as it exists, and they're looking for something that's an alternative. And what's dangerous about that is that a lot more people are taught to think of right-wing messages, to think of right-wing frameworks for understanding the problem of society as the most legitimate, as the most common sense way to handle any problem, punitive, individualistic, etc. And when they hear left-wing ideas coming from too far left, they ultimately just think of them as being illegitimate offhand. So I know that the situation as it exists right now is kind of more favorable to the far right, but I think where the left has, advantage that the far right does not have is that the material reality of the United States of America is going to lead people towards leftist policies, towards organized labor, by nature of that being literally the only solution that could possibly redress their grievance. We're seeing right now the failure of right-wing immigration policy to correct cost of living. We're seeing the failure of right-wing neoconservative foreign policy to fail to make the world safer. And so like we're having a moment where right-wing policy is being delegitimized in real time. And that's why it's so important right now to use this opportunity to legitimize left-wing policy and not just allow for, new further right-wing frameworks to take domination over like the mainstream right and go like, oh, well, you see, Trump didn't fail because his policies were conservative. He failed because his policies weren't really conservative. They weren't far enough right.
I know we're at time, but can I ask you one more question?
You can ask me how many questions you want.
Cool, thank you. Because I did write something down before that I think we kind of were going to skip over, but you just basically led me right into it. So it's about messaging. So conservatives, they love to talk about family values, but they rarely support the material conditions that actually help families survive. So like paid leave, child care, housing security, minimum wage, the child tax credit, public schools, and I could go on and on. So if that's all part of the Democratic and left-wing platform, what's missing from our messaging to claim the idea of family values from an economic perspective?
I would say there's two things missing, right? And I will say I do acknowledge the maybe not, I can't say humor, but the irony in the right-wing messaging, right? They love family values. And, I think it's even beyond that. A lot of the things that conservatives or even like far-right demagogues online fetishize, they imagine were provided to them by some kind of like conservative framework for the economy, or even like outright white supremacy. You'll see them share those like Norman Rockwell style paintings of, all white suburb with white picket fence and a family that can afford a 2-car garage and 2.5 children and like a one family income supporting all of that, rather one income earner supporting all of that. And they're able to imagine that was provided to them by some sort of like racialized conservatism. It's like, no, all of that stuff, the suburbs, the national parks, that stuff is all provided to them by like, more or less economic redistribution. The fact that there was a suburb for like white people to live in was the result of the New Deal, the GI Bill, the economic redistributive policies of FDR. Of course, those policies had a racialized, exclusionary element to them. But generally speaking, those policies were not, conservative. They were used they were leftist in bent, right? And so a lot of the things that like the right fetishizes about America's past wasn't provided to them by their ideology. It was provided to them by leftist ideology. Where I think the Democratic Party still suffers on this front is that they aren't really unapologetic voices for the public sector. They aren't unapologetic voices for the things that I just said, which is that, the suburbs weren't built by, the hard work of white supremacists. The suburbs were built by the economic policies of, left-leaning democratic socialist president in the form of FDR, right? And so like by not being vocal enough, by not being unapologetic enough proponents, they allow for right-wing framings of the world to creep in, which are, delegitimizing of the way Democratic Party tries to sell itself, and also delegitimizing of the way the left tries to sell itself. So I think like what's failing for a lot of people is that while sometimes the superficial message, like the surface level rhetoric might be in favor of those things, a lot of times the underlying messaging around like the value of the public sector, the value of billionaires runs antagonistic to what they might be trying to sell at the highest levels. Like they I think in many ways delegitimize their own talking points by giving credence to right-wing frameworks for a lot of things, and then relying on kind of a vague narrative of empathy and inclusion to try to convince people that their policies are what's best, as opposed to like full-throatedly saying that like, Democrats are, historically better for the economy. So I would say there's an element of that, but I think a lot of the messaging issues are downstream from the ideological issues. I think a lot of times people focus on the messaging because there is a lot of, no offense, a lot of consultants in the Democratic Party that act as, brand consultants, PR type consultants, where their main concern is like, how do you sell the product? Not how good the product is. How do you sell the product? I think we saw some of that with, commentary from more well-entrenched, media liberals who were like, how can we capture this energy for the Democrats? It's like, well, but, also how can we abstract this energy from the policies, the material policies that Zoran supports? And I think in that question, you see an issue with not just their messaging, but with their ideology, which is that they believe that you can have a rhetoric that is energizing to the vast majority of the working class, the vast majority of Americans who are suffering under the current, cost of living crisis, that is totally abstracted from that suffering, that's totally abstracted from any promise to change or alleviate that suffering in a way that I should emphasize that they can believe. Because I think a lot of, and Zoran also in his victory speech made this point, there are a lot of people who have been burned by Democratic Party promises. There are a lot of people who have, believed in Obama. There are a lot of people who believed Obama was going to redress the grievances of the Iraq War, redress the grievances of the 2008 housing crisis, and he didn't. There were a lot of people who voted strategically to ensure that the Supreme Court would stay in the hands of the Democratic Party, or at least have, a majority of left-leaning judges. And they voted strategically, and the Democratic Party didn't act strategically. And so I think there are a lot of people who have been burned before. And I would also say that's, through line for why people also have gravitated towards media like mine and like the Majority Report, because especially if you're within my age group, I think it's hard to look at legacy media outlets. It's hard to look at, outlets like the New York Times, like MSNBC, like CNN, and not see people who failed to hold the Bush administration accountable, not see people who failed to ask the right questions about the Iraq War, to not see people who, not to see networks that fired critics of the Iraq War and the war on terror. And so that distrust has lingered in a lot of people. And it's, I think, it's also there for like just Democratic Party politicians and their brand. I think a lot of people have trouble trusting when they make these promises too.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time talking with Democrats here in the Bay Area, and that is something that comes up a lot, and I know that I joined this club specifically because I am a Democrat, but I also could imagine something better from the party, right? And I could always imagine room for improvement. And that actually is something that a lot of people want. And I think that that's a really healthy way to approach our own politics, and to not get too caught up in the way things were, the way things are, or maybe even just the way that they could be. All right, we do have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Brandon. This was awesome. Next time you're in the United States, I would love for you to come by Alameda. You could meet everybody. Meredith, hello. Did you want to say anything before we go?
No, just also to second Evan's Gratitude. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all this great perspective and insight with us.
You're here. Thank you, Mr. Sutton. You're amazing.
No, I mean, thank you all for inviting me. I really appreciate having the opportunity to have these conversations. And, I know I don't always have the exact right answer for any particular question, but I like to think that having these conversations in and of themselves, even if we go away with, incomplete answers to questions, if we go away with incomplete analyses, at least we have something to think about. We have something to help consider for the future. And so I really do value the time that you allotted to me to, share my ideas and to answer these questions.
Our next events, or our next parts of the speaker series, we have lots of events all the time as the club, but we're going to be speaking with some consumer advocates, both locally and some nationally as well. So this conversation will be continued. And again, I want to thank everybody who was on the call, all of our members, Brandon Sutton, our board, and especially you. Good night.